And how important is the work of translation to improving yourself as an original poet?
Yeah, I think it depends on who you are as a poet. There's not one way to be a poet. There are as many ways to be a poet as there are good poets, and I don't even know that I'm a good poet. But for me, and for many, 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 many of the great poets, translation is extraordinarily important. What I tell young people who want to be poets is to practice translation of great poets and to practice imitation of great poets. So if you're a native English speaker, you can't translate Milton. Well, that's not true. You can translate Milton from Greek and Latin in the poems he wrote in Greek and Latin. But if you're wanting to write in the Miltonic style, you can do an imitation, and it's a sort of similar thing. And I would say, for me, that was extraordinarily important. To learn about the possibilities of language, to learn about the possibilities of form, to learn about, especially with something like French or Latin or Greek, the figura etymologica, where you can form
Hmm.
patterns based on etymons that are sort of subterranean patterns. So you have the illusion of colloquial speech, but they're these subterranean patterns based on etymologies, um, so that the reading so that the reader is pleased on first encountering and can understand it, but can continue to go back into the poem and discover these patterns so that the poem gets richer the more that they understand languages. That's something that Shakespeare certainly does. He's always using the figura etymologica. Um, so yeah, I think with translation, it's invaluable. It's invaluable because it helps you to understand um, the history of ideas to whatever degree. It helps you to understand how different languages are capable of different things and possibilities within your own language. Uh, I mean, it just I could go on and on about what all it teaches, and the great thing about it is that you don't necessarily have to be inspired. The best translations will come, like the best poems, when you're inspired, when there's something a little eldritch happening. But you can sit down any old day and work on a translation in the way that I think as a lyric poet you're not often able to do. Novelists are very good about this. Graham Greene, you get up, you write your 500 words, then you go be crazy Graham Greene the rest of the day and you're fine, right? Your Hemingway, you get up at 6 a.m., you write your 500 words, then you go do Hemingway craziness. With poets, it's harder to get up every day and just write a poem because I'm not feeling inspired every day, but you can always translate, and so it's a way of keeping your toolkit sharp, of picking up new tools, new forms, new images. um, yeah, I just think it's an invaluable tool, and not that everybody has to do it, but I encourage it wherever possible.
How many different languages are represented in this book?
Seven, not counting dialects.
Okay. So, one question I had for you was about specifically studying different languages and poetry in different languages, and how that, I mean, like, qua the language, how does that contribute to your English poetry in different ways? Like, how would learning this or that particular language influence you as a poet in English, abstracted from the subject matter or the individual poet?
Yeah, a lot of it is, as I say, about learning word roots. Uh, the
Hmm.
etymons of words. Uh, when one can use a word uh, with acuity, one is capable of arresting phrasing. So that word acuity is an example, right? Acuity, from acuere, to make sharp. So in the first poem of my book, The Stranger World, it's about a little boy who's sword fighting with his shadow at his birthday party. Uh,
Right.
it's also about the communal murder of the human spirit and demand of conformity. But there's a subterranean pattern to
I
do
was
with
actually just
sharpness.
looking at that. I actually literally, I just photographed that poem and sent it to a friend of mine earlier today, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
So that, in the last stanza of that poem, there's the word manly acumen. right? And acumen is from
Right.
acuere, and so it ties into this pattern of sharpness and blades and really what Rene Girard would call scapegoating. Um,
Mhm.
so you can work in these sort of subtleties, and it's sort of I think a lot of people call them Easter eggs, but it helps you to know what words actually mean and to understand how words are being used by other writers who know their language as well. We have to remember that until the 20th century, every English language poet, with the exception of maybe Keats, had pretty formidable Latin and some Greek, and they're using words in ways that are simultaneously colloquial and activating the etymon to form a subterranean pattern.
Hmm.
And to abandon that entirely is to lose the depth of your poem. So part of it is it helps you
Right.
to create these depths, but it also just helps to create arresting phrases. Manly acumen, you know.
What about the way that different languages lend themselves to different types of poetic form, different ways of working in poetry. So, the way that sort of modern, and I don't mean like 20th century, but modern more broadly, English poetry works is kind of similar in some ways to the way that German poetry works compared to classical Latin poetry. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but how would studying a poetry in a language where the poetry just works totally differently inform your English poetry?
Right. I mean, well, the example would be Greek or Latin. They work entirely differently because they're inflected languages, and the syntax is radically different. We have a very
Right.
Germanic subject verb object structure in almost all of our sentences, and
Right.
that's not in Greek and Latin. And so it's about pliancy of syntax. And to get away from a subject verb object structure in English is tricky because it has to sound like spoken English to some extent. It has to have the illusion of being spoken English. But
Right.
there's a way there's a way that we can do this with fragmentation, with hyperbaton, especially using sort of dashes or parentheses. Uh, there are all sorts of ways that we talk that is not at all the way that you learn to write in English 101, but you can capture some of that in a poem, right? If if you're cognizant of making it meaningful, where it's not just, well, this sounds sort of like talking, but you're using that syntactical arrangement meaningfully in the way that languages like Greek and Latin use their syntax meaningfully. They put words next to each other for a reason. So I'll give you an example in Horace's Ode 1:5. Quis multa gracilis te puer in rosa perfusus liquidis urget odoribus grato pira subantro. So the question is, which Gracilis, which gracile, which handsome, which svelte puer boy Urget pushes up against you down in your cave, Pyrrha? So Horace is talking to someone
Okay.
he's got a crush on, who is
Yeah.
holed up in her cave with a handsome young guy. So in the syntax of that first line, right? So if we said, in an English, just a straightforward English subject verb object, it would be which handsome young man grinds against you, Pyrrha, something like that, right? But the way that it's structured in Latin, quis, which, multa gracilis, very graceful, puer, te, boy, you. The boy and the you and the line are right next to each other because,
Hmm.
of course, in the cave, they're right next to each other, right? The verb doesn't come
Ah,
until way later in line two,
that's
right? So
that's
it's
cool.
quis multa gracilis te puer in rosa. So on roses, on this bed of roses, before we get to the verb, we have the you and the boy right next to each other,
Right. Right.
right? So that's a happy way of using that syntax. When you don't have to have subject, verb, object, you can move things around.
So it can
You
challenge you
can
to stretch your
embody
English. It can challenge you to stretch your English.
exactly. So you can think of ways to create this sort of phenomenon where a line syntactically is embodying what it's describing. Now, this doesn't mean you can't do what Horace did. You can't move the verb later like that, but you can come up with ingenious ways to do things like have the boy and the you next to each other. I'll give you an example, right? So in the 16th and 17th century, as we're anglicizing ceremonies, we see a desire to imitate this effect in Latin. So you finish this line for me. With this ring, I.
Thee wed.
Yeah. Why are I and thee next to each other? Why isn't I wed thee?
Right.
It's the exact same thing. The wed is to join together the I and the thee, as Horace did with the te and the puer, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's that kind of thing. And of course you can't say I thee wed in a contemporary poem, but you get ideas about how syntax can be manipulated to create a version of arrangement that is not just linear, where it's not just the words in a row mean this thing. There's also a vertical element to the arrangement of the words.
That's amazing. Now, is there any danger of adulteration here, like of becoming less English and sort of losing that virile Anglo-Saxon language that Tolkien was so resentful about the Norman conquest, because of
and all the English. I mean, it's why there's still the animosity on behalf of the English against the French. They just don't like that French was the official language of England for 300 years. Yeah, obviously, and translators call it translatees, where you try to imitate the effects of the original to the point where it doesn't sound like English anymore, and that's really a problem. And it's especially a problem when you're translating a language that is similar to English. Like, if you're doing Old English, it's very hard to bring that into contemporary English because so many of our words come out of Latin and French and that Romance tradition. So you're stuck with a bunch of monosyllables, but you don't want to use all monosyllables because it doesn't sound like poetry, right? In the same way, if you're translating from Latin where everything is polysyllabic, you don't want to use all polysyllables because that doesn't sound like English. It has to be this hybrid that I was talking about earlier. You have to find a kind of happy balance. And so, it is imperfect. There's the old joke that in Latin, the verb for translate, traducere, is the same verb as to commit treason. Because you're always committing treason, either to the original or to your language that you're translating into. You're going to lose. You're going to lose something. But it is, I think, a tremendously helpful heuristic to take on these problems and think about how to say things. As Frost said, all the fun's in how you say a thing, right? And again, as I was saying earlier, many of the ideas in poems are quite banal. You're going to die.
Right.
Make the most of that. Nature is pretty, but the fun is in how you say it, right? And the more languages you read, the more great poets you read in different languages, the more you see a variety of ways of saying things, a variety of ways of patterning poems, a variety of ways of structuring them, beginning, middle, and end, to say nothing of the actual forms